I mean, like, there are some pretty strange characters that sort of populate the early field of, I don't know, like trans medicine or trans studies. I don't know how you would call it, but the one guy I want to talk about right now is a guy named Richard Green, who worked on, quote, gender variant boys. Richard Green oversees a study at UCLA called the Feminine Boy Project, which becomes the basis for his book, The Sissy Boy Syndrome. Could you explain to me what the Feminine Boy Project and the Sissy Boy Syndrome
Can you
are?
explain to me how this guy wasn't killed on site? Like,
I can't explain that.
I need a research grant for the Feminine Boy Project. How did they not call the police? Jesus.
What was the original name of your podcast?
When my brother was he told me the story from when he was in high school, that there was this kid in his German class who, like, everyone, including the teacher, bullied, and they had to, like, write personal essays, and the kid that everyone bullied wrote a story about, like, losing some tennis match, and the German teacher suggested calling his story "My Feminine Mistake."
Wow.
So I always laughed at it. It's so fucking mean, but, like, he would be one of the feminine boys.
So, look, basically, as long as we have medical records of this, our good friend Jules Gill Peterson, who wrote a really great book about the history of this, basically all this horrible shit. She works at Johns Hopkins, where some of the earliest trans care is done, and she, like, got to go in and look at the medical records, and it's
Yeah, I
pretty
learned that
horrifying.
from the film Silence of the Lambs.
Yeah. Well, no, but what happened is that, like, basically as early as we have records, we have kids who were a little bit fruity one way or the other, kids who were maybe just a little bit feminine, or like outright cross-dressing, or fully just like, I want to be a girl. And the treatment for these kids, very occasionally you would have parents that would be supportive of this, but most of the time it would be forced out of them. In like the 30s and 40s and 50s, they would basically be sent to these like psychiatric clinics where they would be like electroshocked, and they would have to put guards outside of the bathrooms to stop rape from happening. It's really, really depressing. And eventually, as the decades go on, people are curious as to, these sexologists like Richard Green, who are okay with gay people. Like, Richard Green was one of the people who voted to get homosexuality taken out of the DSM, but less okay with trans people or transsexuality for a confusing variety of reasons. Like, these old clinicians were just throwing fucking darts at the wall to try and figure shit out. But Richard Green, he starts this project because he wants to essentially observe all of these gender variant boys and see if they, like, what happens to them. Now, the first thing that needs to be said is that he was not just observing them. He was doing this like Pavlovian behavioral therapy with them, where it's like, if they, I don't know, they would like be put in a room with like Barbie dolls and, I don't know, like action figures.
Tonka trucks.
Yeah, and if they went over to the Tonka trucks, they'd get rewarded, and if they went over to the Barbie dolls, they'd get ignored. And it's also important to remember, like, not all of these kids were what we would now call a trans kid. A lot of these kids were just like, one of them in the book that we read on, like, the Feminine Boy Project, was sent there because he said he wanted to be a girl. And when his parents asked him why he wanted to be a girl, he said, because boys have to go to the army and die.
It's a good, pretty reasonable response as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, there's nothing like, I don't like my body, I don't like my gender. It was literally just like, I don't want to die.
And the reason why Green was like so concerned about these like gender nonconforming boys is because he was talking to a lot of these adult transsexuals who said, like, basically had a similar story to them as a kid of like, oh, I was feminine, oh, I socialized with girls. And so Green comes to the conclusion of like, well, like, maybe we can't convert them out of being gay, but we can convert them out of being trans functionally. We can make it so they don't like socialize with like female children. We should make sure they like don't play with Barbie dolls. And then maybe they won't come out. They'll be less likely to come out as transsexuals.
That's interesting because, like, a lot of what these very same people, like, they were at the forefront of proving through their attempts to, through aversion therapy to get people to change their sexual orientation. They were among the people at the forefront of stating conclusively that that's impossible. So why not the next logical leap towards someone's gender identity rather than their sexual identity?
There's kind of like this folk wisdom among this group that emerges. A lot of them, like Richard Green, studied directly under this guy named John Money. John Money and Richard Green. It's great names.
Which was the Birdman there?
Oh, John Money. If you've looked at the allegations for John Money, he's definitely the Birdman.
Did he kiss Richard Green?
Did he molest the money?
So what happened with John Money was this, he worked at the Johns Hopkins Gender Clinic. UCLA and Johns Hopkins were like the two hubs. It's kind of like the East Coast and West Coast of this. And John Money's views on gender identity are incoherent. They're like completely incoherent. They don't make any fucking sense. Liv and I spent like an entire afternoon trying to figure out like what the hell this guy actually believes. And he also did some of the most horrific things in this whole series. He got like, there was this kid named David Reamer, who was like a victim of a botched circumcision. And what John Money's suggestion is give this 22-year-old SRS and then raise him as a girl. And they did that. 22-month-old. Sorry. Give this 22-month-old child SRS and raise him as a girl. And they did. And David Reamer obviously found out what was going on and changed back to being a boy as soon as he found out. And then when both him and his twin brother, who have alleged that John Money sexually abused both of them, I don't know if that's true, but the allegations are out there. Both of them committed suicide in their late 30s. So he is a complete fucking monster. But he seemed to think that like there was a window in early childhood, either like until you were 3 or until you were 10 or so, that you can change gender identity, that it's plastic and malleable. I don't know how he got to this conclusion because a lot of his written writing contradicts that. Like there's no coherent through line going on, but it seems like it's almost taken as like an empirical claim that you have this small window with kids where you can kind of like, I don't know, you can get them out of being trans, but you might have to keep them gay.
So I mentioned at the beginning that transsexual is a medical category. It's not considered appropriate to refer to trans people as transsexuals. But like, when does trans as a medical category first appear? And like, what are some of the earliest in the medical community? What are the earliest interactions like or discoveries of this, so to speak?
It really comes out of like, it's really the 20s and the 30s where they start synthesizing like testosterone and estrogen, where it starts becoming
even the 10s when like Magnus Hirschfeld was going around like German drag bars and hanging out there.
Right. Like they initially would conduct these experiments on like chickens, for instance. And they're like, oh, if you inject them with testosterone, they change their sexual characteristics and start acting like males. It's really a couple decades later that like some people start reading about this being possible and being like going to doctors and being like, hey, can you do this to me? It would be like Christine Jorgensen is a good example of this woman in the 50s, or like male to female trans woman in the 50s, who reads in a book somewhere that that's possible. And then because it wasn't legal in the States at the time, goes to Denmark repeatedly and tries to like find this relatively secluded doctor who was eventually willing to give her access to like medical hormones and surgeries. And she was initially trying to be like stealth. She didn't want anyone to know that she was transsexual, but she was outed very publicly when she returned to New York. And she became this kind of like attraction, the sideshow of like people suddenly realized that it was possible to medically transition, which subsequently led to a lot of attention around this possibility. And then doctors and sexologists kind of had to respond to that problem, which they really viewed it as a problem of like, people want to change their sex because they want to be, the opposite gender. What do we do about it? And the general
how do we
answer,
acclimate these people back into the working world is huge. Like they really were concerned that you had all of these transsexuals who were not working and not productive. And they were like, we're going to turn these people into secretaries, basically.
Which is really one of the reasons why they preferred like formerly gay men to allow them to medically transition, because they could transition into heterosexual women. Which one of the reasons why they like mainly picked people who were conventionally sort of feminine to allow access to like the very limited slots for medical transition in the period, was because it's just they didn't want any more visible queerness in society. They were like, we can take these like working girls, these lower class gay men who have a really bad social result because they're like gay men, and then bring them up into the middle class, allow them to be a part of like the baby boom. And this is kind of a disastrous result for any trans people who aren't kind of included within this concept, and really disastrous result for most trans people because the spots in these like academic gender clinics to allow for transition were like very narrow. There's
And
like
they would
20 or
not
30
be covered.
people.
They would barely like they'd almost never be covered by any like insurance. So
Mhm.
I think like 2,000 people applied to the Hopkins clinic, and I think 24 got in.
Yeah. Another really big part of this is that these like sexologists who are like, oh, I mean, I guess we can use medical transition to make these people's lives better. We're very worried. It's a very American thing about being sued. And so
Yes.
they're like, that's why people like traditionally trans people had to jump through so many hoops to get access to transition, is you want to create a docile subject who isn't going to sue you. So it's like,
Yeah.
you're really, really sure that they actually want to transition.
In Canada, before you even got hormones, you would have to live as the opposite sex for 2 years.
Well, that was
in
the
like the
same in the States too.
1970s.
Yeah. Which is like awful. Like imagine just like having to, if you're like a male audience listener, just like having to live as a woman for 2 years without any like medical intervention,
No hormones.
especially in the 70s.
Yeah, in the 1970s.
So it really is this like clinical old guard that gets overturned in the aughts and the 2010s.
The present moment we're in, because like you mentioned like at the beginning of the episode, like it could not be grimmer for the rights and dignity of trans people in America or just in the West, as it appears like any sort of public affirmation or legal framework for which they to exist in is being steadily eroded, if not outright destroyed. But like this is occurring now in the context of a culture, at least if you are not a right winger or an extremely religious person. As far as like the medical community goes, the broader mainstream culture has thoroughly accepted gay or lesbian identities, right? And the idea that if even your kid, even in early adolescence, says to you, "Mom, Dad, I'm gay," we all understand now that that's like they know enough about themselves to make that determination about their own personhood and identity. But really, like the irony being like almost the exact moment that gay and lesbian identities were sort of legally and culturally accepted broadly, that trans identities are now often by the very same people under such dire attack. Like, what is it about the history that you uncover in this podcast that you looked into that speaks? Like, do you find that there's an explanation to be had there for why we as a society or a medical community can accept gay people but not trans people now?
It's an interesting question. Like there definitely is precedent in this old guard of trans clinicians, right? Like people who accepted homosexuality, they said conversion therapy doesn't work for it, but it also does work for transsexuals. You can kind of shift them off the change in gender identity. And like in 2015, for instance, when Ontario and then Canada banned conversion therapy, you had a lot of people who were kind of from this discourse of like ostensibly pro-gay, but for conversion therapy for trans people, who were saying like, hey, no, like we should only allow conversion therapy for transsexuals. It's like a different, epistemologically speaking, thing.
Even
we have
though
all
they've
this
already
like, science.
conclusively proved that conversion therapy does not work for
Right.
gay people.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. The fact is that like trans existence is so thoroughly tied up in requiring permission from medical authorities, and the fact that that doesn't exist as much for gay people and lesbians, it did for a brief moment. One story that we don't talk about in the series, but is kind of eerily reminiscent of the 2010s tipping point, was during the AIDS crisis when the FDA was kind of being slow with AZT trials for AIDS, and groups like ACT UP were basically like, we don't care what the side effects are. We need these drugs now because we're all dropping dead. And that's, I think, similar to in the 80s, 90s, and especially the aughts and 10s, how there was this slow churn to where trans people got more input into their own medical treatment, and how now that is basically being pulled away really rapidly.
Yeah. You see like a lot of like members of anti-trans backlash will contextualize these early history of, these weird freakish sexologists as like the creators of transsexuality, when in reality it is this similar like antagonistic relationship that like gays and lesbians have with relation to ACT UP to the medical community.
And to like Anthony Fauci and like the NIAID.
Speaking of the characters that populate this series, in researching and writing this series and doing it, which figure were you the most interested to learn about? And then, like a corollary to that, which figure do you find the most detestable and evil, and which one do you find the most sympathetic?
I would say the most detestable is Kenneth Zucker, although a lawyer's advised me not to tell you why.
Kenneth Zucker is a legally I can't say that he's a conversion therapist, but he more or less is a conversion therapist. He worked in Ontario. He worked at the Clark Institute, which was like the hub for a lot of these people. And he kind of pioneered this model of transition care called living in your own skin, which was basically just Pavlovian conditioning for trans kids under the age of like 14 or so. There'd be parents of gay kids or trans kids. They'd bring them to Zucker's clinic, and Zucker would be like, okay, you got to take away all the girl toys. You got to take away all this stuff. And like beyond that, he would be like, your friend can't have your kid can't have female friends. Your kid can't even like draw girls. They have to start drawing men or whatever. And yeah,
I'm against having female friends too. I'm not going to end up in that zone.
Zucker is trying to make sure kids don't get friend zoned.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not going to I'm not have my son just be the shoulder to cry on. He's going to be getting close to this motherfucker.
But Zucker got fired in 2015 because after the suicide of Lila Alcorn in the States, there was like a kind of like a big call to ban conversion therapy and really crack down on it. And CAMH did like an internal review and was like, yeah, this guy's doing conversion therapy. And Zucker had to like kind of flee into private practice. For me, the most detestable guy in all of this is Paul McHugh, who is this Catholic psychiatrist who Hopkins Clinic was kind of thriving a little bit in the 70s. And then McHugh comes in and he explicitly states that he's coming to the Hopkins Clinic to shut it down. Like he doesn't, like he's Catholic. He's opposed to this on principle. He doesn't give a shit. And he has this like sham internal review commissioned about the efficacy of, transsexual surgery in the 70s. And what they like kind of finagle out of it is like, they're happy with it, but it's not doing anything to make them better, quote unquote. So the whole clinic gets shut down and doesn't reopen until like 2017. And he's also involved with like all this weird stuff where he would like testify on behalf of accused priests. Like he's a really sinister figure.
Yeah, that is something I wanted to ask about. This is sort of overlaps with stuff from Searching for a Friend at the End of the World, but there is this weird overlap with a lot of these people who have had kind of a renaissance in the past 3 or 4 years, but there is a subset of these guys, kind of like this guy who, when they're not, spearheading projects called like the Feminine Boy Project, they're incredibly involved in stuff with, like false memory theory, or we're just outright NAMBLA members.
Oh,
but
yeah.
Can you go into the connection a little bit with the false memory stuff and some of these guys?
Yeah, because I was going to say the most detestable person, or at least the most dangerous person that I came across in this, is a woman named Elizabeth Loftus, who, let's just say her work on the, quote, non-reliability of memory takes some very strange and dark turns in terms of her legal expertise that she auctions off.
Be careful, Will, because Elizabeth Loftus is something of a secular saint for like weird skeptic communities. Like if you're still really into Richard Dawkins, or like you're gonna be a Jerry Coyne or Steven Pinker, you're gonna be a ride or die for Elizabeth Loftus.
Are there people who are still into Steven Pinker?
Yeah, I think so. I don't think Pinker has that many shooters. I think he's too weird. I know like Jerry Coyne has a few, Dawkins has a few. All those guys still have like fan bases, which is, again, I felt like we had moved past that whole thing.
Well, I mean, I guess like from what I gather, it's that we should all be very skeptical of people testifying against us in high profile criminal trials.
Yeah, that's seems to be the right.
Yeah, we should all be very skeptical of the testimony of victims because they probably made it up or had some false memories implanted in them.
So false memory syndrome stuff, like the background for this is in the 1980s, there's the Satanic Panic, which I don't think I really need to explain to you all. And one of the vectors upon which, the Satanic Panic happens is these kind of like quack psychotherapists who would use stuff like hypnosis and drugging to like coerce people into telling like stories like, I don't know, like the Michelle Remembers stories, or I guess maybe like Jordan, Minnesota, some of these things. And I will say that a lot of these like 80s ones where people were like getting memories of being like abducted by aliens, or like being sent to like a doom level and having their organs pulled out. Those are a little I don't really believe those. But in the 80s, there's also just this rising trend of understanding about how widespread a problem incest and child sexual abuse are. And as these cases, like, people start basically suing their parents, not on like memories they recovered in therapy, like memories they've just had. And a lot of people, like, what happens is that a lot of states, there's really strict statutes of limitations for things. So states start updating their statutes, and this like circuit of high profile witnesses emerges to like testify against these accusers. And it's made complicated because, again, in the 80s, you have stuff like McMartin, although I know there's some McMartin truthers out there, and I'm not trying to offend them. Just take it as an example. Jordan, Minnesota, Michelle Smith, like all these stories. But there also are ones where there was not like, blood rituals involved. It was just pretty standard abuse. And among these groups of expert witnesses like Elizabeth Loftus and accused parents, they kind of formed this group in the 1990s in response to this one family's, this dad getting accused of sexual abuse by the daughter, called the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. And it was a collection of surprisingly high profile people in like psychology. Like Loftus is still a really big name, but also Aaron Beck, who is the father of cognitive behavioral therapy, and a couple of people with suspicious, kind of spooky resumes like Martin Orn. They all like kind of come together, and their goal is to basically like change laws, appear in these criminal cases, and also like change the media narrative about child sexual abuse, and kind of change it away from stories about, people suing their parents who molested them into stories of false memories and memory implantation and recovered memory and false accusations and all these things. And some of these people, I'm sure some of the people in the False Memory Syndrome Foundation are just like annoying skeptics who like were annoyed by the Satanic Panic stuff and kind of contrarian themselves into this. But there were a few that were just like outright NAMBLA types. Me and Liv's favorite was Ralph Underwager, who was this Lutheran minister who like would just say the most insane shit in interviews.
Yeah.
And everyone's like, yeah, it's fine.
The quote here from Ralph Underwear is, "It is more desirable that 1,000 children in abuse situations are not discovered than one person to be wrongly accused of abuse."
I like how he takes the standard, like, that old quote about the justice system, and then he multiplies it by 100.
What the fuck?
Well, he also,
I think he just started out saying it's preferable that 1,000 kids get abused. Someone was like, preferable to what? And he went, that one guy get falsely accused.
I mean, like, not to put too fine a point on it, but like, in our current, the anti-trans backlash and people who are trans skeptic or just like outright, bigots or just right-wing psychos. I mean, like the stick to which to attack trans identity and trans people has always been child abuse. They're grooming kids. It's pedophilia. But like, what the fuck is going on between the connection between like the trans skeptical medical and scientific community and their, I don't know, advocacy for pedophilia?
Talk about Paideca a little bit, Liv, since this is the only funny thing in the entire series. The rest of it's depressing.
Yeah, there's this like Dutch pro-pedophile journal that like a lot of these guys just like are taking interviews from. Ralph Underwear is another example. Ralph Underwear and his wife were in a pro-pedophile interview.
Yeah, he got fired from the False Memory Syndrome Foundation because like some journalist dug up that he gave an interview for the for Paideca, and he said like pedophiles were chosen by God to affirm their identities. And then when people got mad at him, he was like, "You took it out of context."
That's like the stuff that like the Rourke brother who's a cardinal says in Sin City. Like that's like Frank Miller dialogue.
But what Paideca, like people kept giving interviews to it. Like John Money gave an interview to it. There's this other sexologist who got in a lot of trouble in the 90s because he published a really bad study that suggested that child sexual abuse doesn't actually hurt people. And he gave an interview to Paideca, and it just kept coming up more and more in our research. But like to answer yeah, we said it was like the Velvet Underground of pedophilia. Not everyone read Paideca, but the people who did, What is it? I mean, again, a lot of it comes out. They study sexology, and transsexuality and pedophilia to these people are the same thing. And not in like the homophobic Christian way of it's like, oh, gays, they recruit. They just see it as like weird paraphilias to be treated compassionately but firmly. But since the window has shifted and trans people are more accepted now, versus pedophiles are not accepted now, some of them have kind of like corrected themselves into being like, oh no, pedophiles are fine. It's the trans people that are problem.
Yeah. That's the odd part. That's the part that doesn't add up to me.
I mean, with there's different national versions of this. With America, it is these types of guys who like, we're either just like straight up in a NAMBLA type organization, or like there's some weird false memory association thing. But with the UK, I've noticed it's always guys who like they wrote an article for The Spectator or something like a billion years ago that's like, can we just admit that, like, it's fine when kids get molested in school? Like, it's not that bad.
Yeah.
Like, there's so many, whenever I look up, like, a British journalist who's gotten really into, like, gender critical or just, like, boosts those people, they always have a story in one of, like, the perennial conservative newspapers that's, like, the headline is literally, abuse victims, get over it.
Yeah, it's like one of those Guardian profiles where they have, like, their face next to it. It's all fucked up looking. Yeah. It's like top 10 times I was molested and it didn't bother me.
Yeah.